This is your island, Dennis said. It's a rocky one. The only place to land a boat is through that narrow inlet. Hector and Dennis dropped Mazz off and headed back to their island. Mazz stood on the dock and looked at his tropical island paradise and said to himself, I think I'm going to like it here. A man stood at the end of the dock and waved to Mazz. I'm Tony, your survival consultant, the man said, as he walked over and shook Mazz's hand. Tom Fletcher sent me here to prep your island. Come on up to your compound. At the top of the hill, hidden from the lagoon, was a small building. Tony waved to it and said, This is your new home, Mazz. Why don't you stow your gear and put on some hiking shoes? I'll give you a tour. Tony began his tour with the water system. There's no surface or groundwater on this island, he said, so you'll have to collect rainwater. There's also a desalination backup. Tony showed Mazz the solar and wind generators. There's enough power and battery storage for all your household needs and the electric boat. Tony showed Mazz his Radio Shack. On a good day, Tony said, you should be able to tune into shortwave radio stations around the world. It's a good way to keep track of the world going to hell in a handbasket while you sit here in paradise. Tony invited Mazz to inspect the storeroom built into the side of the hill. You have enough freeze-dried, shrink-wrapped food to last 30 years or more. You also have a garden and seeds if you want something fresh and green. And as long as the sun shines, Tony said, you can cook with this solar oven. Tony took a device off a shelf and showed it to Mazz. This is a radiation detector. You may not need it. On the other hand, I've heard rumors that the elites in a few nations are planning to set off some nukes to create a nuclear winter to geoengineer a pause in the rate of global warming. It's a desperate measure to be sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if they tried it.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on Poetry of Predicament, we're going to be talking with artist and political commentator Ken Avidor. He's actually pretty well known in the doomasphere for his getting darker and darker interpretations of what we're up against now and what we're looking at in the near future. But I think you'll find out in today's conversation he's got a lot of other things that he does in terms of expressing his art and his political commentary. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ken Avidor.
It's if anyone does not like unhappy endings,
Yeah,
I'm not going to like my work. So, but we can. I'm sure we have a lot to discuss, and I very much appreciate your point of view. That there's a lot of work to be done in preparing for this future that we face. So, with that, with those disclosures, let's continue.
All right. Well, thanks, Ken, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And what you may have already guessed, having watched a couple of previous interviews, I speak with a lot of different kinds of people. Yeah, some of them are experts in either climate change or some aspect or another of human-caused collapse of Earth or human systems. But there's an awful lot of folks that really I speak with because they have a way of articulating their experience of this most extraordinary time. My experience of now is there has never been a time like this in human history. Never global. Sure, there's been existential pockets in time and location, but never at the scale of the entire globe and all of humanity and all of the beyond human earthlings as well. And to me, there's no more important conversation to be had, and especially when somebody has the ability to bring some of their own creativity, their own art and heart to what we're looking at. And I saw that the first time I saw any of your work. And so, yeah, I just knew I wanted to talk with you because, I'm not much of an artist of any kind. Like I've done some sculpting, I've done some drawing, but it's just not nearly a gift like you have. Yeah, it's rare to find somebody who's on apparently such a similar wavelength in terms of what we're really facing. You've got a couple of your videos, which there are roughly 7 of them on Vimeo that I've been able to find, and Countdown to Extinction is one of them that's just you have a number of them that are kind of post-apocalyptic, and okay, fair enough, but there's this kind of universal challenge of how do we express this to others. It's one thing to just grapple with it in our own heart, but kind of by definition, you're an artist and you need other people to experience your work to validate it, much like what I guess I do with video and so on. And so, welcome here. I'd love to just have this be conversational. I'm not worried about you being an expert about anything. I'm certainly not. So let me just do a kind of an official welcome and startup, and then we can have it be just a little bit more predictably paced and so on. But I just mostly wanted to welcome you and let you know that I really appreciated straight away the work
Well,
that you're
thank
doing.
you for having me on your channel.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I was just talking with our guest today and letting them know that, there are a lot of different kinds of folks that show up here on the Poetry of Predicament. And I'm particularly interested in and glad to have Ken Avidor here as as a kind of a representative briefly of the artistic community, the cartoonist community, the illustrator community, uh, because there are so many overlaps in that seem to be there in Ken's way of seeing and representing, and my own way of kind of seeing his work. And I'm about to find out if there's as much overlap as I think there is. So, we're going to find out about Ken's creation of some videos, some books of his illustrations, and what they communicate. And Ken, I'm going to blow my own cover early on here. I got to find out if you're the same person that wrote the book that I found on Amazon about. I think it's called The Madness of oh gosh darn it, the congressperson.
Michelle Bachman.
Michelle Bachman.
Yes, I'm actually one of 3 co-authors of that book. And I used to do political blogging, and that I think I've kind of worn out my welcome with all political parties.
Yeah.
And at present, I would describe myself as a political orphan.
Yeah.
But I think all of us have had disappointments in that realm, and
Yeah.
so I always like these days to just limit myself. I'm sort of like I feel like Candide. I'm cultivating my own garden. So
Yeah.
that's where I am. And literally, actually, I have a wonderful garden in the back of me. Indiana's a great place to grow veggies and flowers, and we try to be as self-sufficient as we can right here in the middle of the city.
All right. Great. Well, maybe a good place to start, Ken, is to ask you for just a little bit more of whatever you'd like to share about what got you into illustration, and then perhaps more importantly, what got you into seeing the world through this frame of we're passing tipping points where it's pretty obvious. I mean, to say it as diplomatically as possible, that this coming generation is quite clearly going to be the first in quite a few that is not better off than the one before it. And to not be very diplomatic about it, what we're looking at is sometimes called human caused collapse of Earth and human systems, and sometimes called disruption of the business as usual world. And for some, it's actually called near-term human extinction. So I know that there's quite a range there, and so I'm just curious if you would tell us a little bit about what got you into that frame of mind. What sort of seeing, what sort of upbringing has you see the world in that way, and then anything you'd like to bridge about your illustration, like how does that function as a way for you to express yourself in the world?
Well, thanks, Dean, and it's great to be here to talk about these things, which is a very difficult conversation to have with anyone. So I'm very glad that we can agree on the groundwork here, which is that we're talking about very difficult, emotionally, spiritually, in all kinds of ways, intellectually. A subject about human extinction, which is a very real possibility at this point. And there's definitely collapses involved in that. And I'm a very big history buff. And there have been, as you said, there have been times when we've experienced things, we've experienced collapse in different ways. And we can learn from that. In my work, when I try to imagine the future, I draw on those historical ideas. And I always tell people that a lot of my ideas are not original. In fact, very few are. So it's kind of a mashup of a lot of ideas. And you've had people on your show who are experts, and I draw from those people. I'm sure people who are watching this are probably familiar with climate, the people who have been involved in climate, who are telling us that these tipping points are coming. And they seem to be coming rather fast and furious at the moment. But I look ahead. And my artwork it's partly my therapy, but it's also, I think, a useful way to engage other people in these conversations, to illustrate these difficult concepts. For instance, the video where you contacted me on the Vimeo of the Vimeo video of Mazz Alone, in which it's a story about very wealthy people who go to an island. And I imagine this is after, if everyone's familiar with the term, the Blue Ocean event, when the ice in the Antarctic is gone. That the changes in the Earth's circulation, its patterns and weather circulation, will undoubtedly change from that point in a very rapid way. So they escape to an island, these wealthy people that they bought, and actually island chain, and they start their own billionaire community. Now, I was actually inspired by real events. There were a couple of years ago stories about very wealthy people looking for places to bug out in the event that everything goes very bad. So I imagine that, and also involved in that, I'm able to write about how collapse would precede the environmental, and will also, along with the environmental effects, global climate change. So it will exacerbate, but what can people do I was most concerned, what can people do with their feelings, with their emotions. How do they deal? There's an interior thing that goes on when people are involved in some kind of disaster. And this is going to be a disaster on a global scale. So part of that is that's come from me, from my own exploration of the character Mazz. People ask me, who is that based on? And it's based on probably, every movie says, not based on any people living or dead. So it's really kind of a combination, but mostly the interior of Mazz, the main character of Mazz, is how I think. And I think many of your listeners have, and probably yourself, have gone through the stages of grief. I don't remember how many there are, but it's 7, isn't it? But
there is actually a 7 version, but I think the one you're talking about is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, which is traditionally talked about as 5, but don't matter. I get you. I'm with you.
And so there's the anger. We're angry. How did we get to this situation? Who allowed this to happen? And we have culprits that we can name. You go through all those, and then eventually we get to the acceptance of it. Not saying that everyone has to do it the same way. That's how I got to it, because I could do it through my art. Artwork is the way I connect with the world around me. Perception is really something I'm very much fascinated with. And how people perceive this crisis that we're entering is very interesting to me as well. Mazz Alone is probably the one that, and watch it on Vimeo, because on YouTube it's in serial form, it's by chapters, as it originally was. But if you want to watch the whole thing, it's 20 minutes, and I'll have, spoiler alert, is it does not have a happy ending. So I don't expect this to be, this work that I do, I don't expect it to be popular. And it's free, but it's, I'm not going to get wealthy from it, but that's not why I did it. I did it in part to work out my own feelings about extinction, but also to connect with people like yourself and your listeners, and I welcome them to contact me in comments and let me know what they think.
Right on. Well, it's sure been, I'm actually surprised that it's been as much of a journey for me as it has to watch your, the various chapters you were talking about with Mazz Alone and the other standalone videos that you got on Vimeo. That's all I've pretty much seen of your work. And it's interesting. I've been a grief facilitator for a long time, and I'm just now kind of reviewing the grief facilitator work, that kind of a volunteer training, if you will. Here where I live in Southern Oregon, there's a little agency that helps people with their grief issues, and I'm one of their facilitators. And I've been similarly moved with your work and with that grief training. Both of them, there was nothing new. Both of them, I knew what was being talked about. But with both your images, your storylines, and so on, and also this facilitator training review, there was something about being able to sit back and not be a facilitator. I'm not the teacher training the class. I'm just a guy, and I'm reviewing stuff that really comes down to as close to kind of the bare bones of what it is to face this daunting future that you're pointing at. And I believe, yeah, you and I both know that, we both see what's going on. So it's nothing new. But there's something about just softening and shifting out of the role of somehow leading or facilitating or interviewing in a podcast and so on, and just being able to kind of let it in. And it's been very, very moving, both of them. So
I think one of the things that's very, and another thing I did mention earlier is that in my work, and not all my work is, I think Mazz Alone is probably the final thing that I have to say about near-term human extinction.
Hmm.
The work that I'm doing now is, well, it doesn't have any, it's just purely dystopian and has no redeemable social value. That's what I'm doing. But you're talking about the journey that we all make when I'm sure that when you, I mean, I'm assuming always been an environmentalist, and I was too. I should probably mention my journey. You mentioned
Yeah.
part of it, which is when I was doing political things. But there was a time in the 1980s, and I lived in New York before that. I'm really a child of the Cold War atomic age. I did the duck and cover. I lived in New York at the time.
Mhm.
As a child, I had the idea that I'd probably be dead very soon. And I became obsessed with that. But there was also in the culture of that time, we had many artistic images, expressions in film, theater, everywhere of that fear that people had, that the world was really on the brink with nuclear war, which almost happened several times. But I was very much inspired with Strange Love, Fail Safe, On the Beach, and books and TV shows. What is odd to me now is that there isn't a lot of imagining of that future regarding extinction or the other things that are contributing to collapse and all this. There's not. I guess maybe people are too much involved in social media they're too busy tweeting to do any imagining and creating. Or maybe it's also that the notion that all of this around us that we perceive are human, our this human adventure that began millions of years ago is at its end. And maybe that's just too much to think about and imagine into creative work. It's a story without, like I said before, without a happy ending. In particularly as Americans in our culture, we like our happy endings.
Mm-hmm.
European, they to some degree they can handle bad endings that don't end well. Americans are not. So, but I understand. A little bit more about my journey. So, in the 80s, 1980s, I became aware of terrible. I moved. My wife and I moved to Minnesota and became more aware of the environment because New York, New York City, there's no environment. Not it's a human place, but I became aware of, like, for instance, things like pesticides, and then in late 80s, global warming became a big deal. But I felt that there was something that I felt a call to action, that there was something that I could do maybe to educate people, so that this predicament could be averted. Back then, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was much lower. And I was influenced by a great many. I sent a list to all the authors who influenced. One of them being Ivan Illich, who was a great critic of the industrial way of doing things. The industrial way of doing transportation, education, and medicine. And he's been absolutely right about all of that. How it detaches us from nature and our fellow human beings. Under the influence of Ivan Illich and others, I thought that there was a way that we could restructure the way we do things that was non-industrial and maybe avert this catastrophe. I had a weekly comic at that time about a victim of this industrial world, a squirrel. We've seen them so often when we're on the road. A squirrel is run over by a car. Well, this squirrel gets run over. He has a tire track, but he comes back to life every time, and he has a message for people, a call to action. And I did that for 3 years, and I did other work that was environmental, and so became a very big proponent of alternative transportation in urban areas. But some years ago, I became aware of the near-term human extinction, that the Arctic was rapidly changing, and it has accelerated a great deal, particularly this year. I learned then that the call to action was actually not something that was, in my opinion, productive for me, and I stopped doing it. Instead, I started looking. I went through some terrible times of depression, anger, all those things. And finally, I think I'm still working it all out, but I'm doing some things that are very different now. One of the things I think, just for myself, that's important is being looking upon my community, the people around me, and wanting to be more engaged, living in the moment that we're in. I think people are actually wonderful, and I used to be very judgmental as far as things like using carbon. If somebody got on a plane and went to Europe, I thought, but I don't do that anymore. I think that if people are trying to enjoy themselves, that's some kind of the important thing right now for them. And I like seeing people enjoying themselves. And so a number of things that I do art-wise now is I make the videos, and I use sketches to do that. They're not animated. They're really what's called an animatic. It's sort of like turning the page on a book and telling a story at the same time. So it's not live action, it's not animation, but I can do it fairly quickly. I use a kind of sketching and materials that I used to do in courtrooms, where I had to be very fast in sketching hearings and trials, that sort of thing. So it works very well. But the other thing I do with my sketching is I do something that's called, for a couple decades now, something called urban sketching. I take around a journal, which is like this. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, and it's I sketch right in it, and I put I don't know if everyone can see that, but it's people. Put stickers and all kinds of things. I've been doing that for a number of years, and it's called, I do live sketching, which is I sketch right there. And if you get an immediate thing, and when I sketch people, which I really love to do, I talk with them sometimes, and many times actually, and something comes through that informs the drawing. It becomes more, for me, more real. I understand that person. I understand how that person sees themselves. And everyone has the experience. They wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, or they look at a photograph of themselves and say, "That's not me." I always enjoy drawing people as they see themselves, as I learn about them. And very often I give them the sketch. If it's not in my journal, I just give it to them, take a picture, and put it on my Instagram, which you can follow. If you do a search for Ken Avidor, you'll find my sketches. And check out my wife's too. She does the same thing. But urban sketching, there's groups in every city that does it. And that's one way of connecting with other people through art. Another thing which probably is more relevant to this discussion is I do chalk drawings. I love to do chalk drawings on the sidewalk. And it's entertaining. It's kind of a performance thing, a lot like live sketching. But what I particularly like about the chalk drawing is it's ephemeral art. It's here today and gone tomorrow, and with the rain and the wind and everything else. I've gotten so used to that temporary nature of that artwork. And I actually like that it only exists for a short time. Well, it exists on, I always take a picture and put it on social media, but really it's not like a painting that's supposed to last forever. I think that's a big, I imagine, I don't do painting, my wife is a painter. But I imagine for many painters, the notion that something that they've invested so much time and skill, and they've chosen materials that have a light fastness so that the colors won't fade for hundreds of years. To get used to the notion that all of this, the world around them, there won't be people to look at your art. If it exists, it'll be in museums that will decay, and the art will decay along. And there's very unlikely, unless of course aliens come, but there will be no humans to see it. And I'm sure that's a very difficult thing. So I sorry about that. The way I deal with it is I do ephemeral. I do the sketches that I give away, and chalk drawings that wash away. So, and anything that's on the internet, if anyone thinks that's permanent, it's just electronic. It's pixels on a screen. It's a JPEG that exists, a code on a server somewhere. But that is also ephemeral too. I like to think of the internet as sort of like the pyramids in Egypt, except the amount of effort that went into building the internet, the billions, trillions of hours that people invested in making the internet, and yet it'll be gone in the blink of an eye, won't it?
Yeah.
But the pyramids will still be there. So does that explain my journey?
It's a lot of it. I appreciate it. That's helps to fill in some of the gaps that I certainly had. So I'm tempted to jump ahead to something that you mentioned at the beginning of this last stretch, where you kind of let us know in advance what you're doing now, and I'm so curious about that. It seems like for you to be on what sounded like a bit more focused in on the post-apocalyptic view, and I'm not quite clear what you're doing. How is that different than the pieces that you've done before? What sort of track would you say you're on now in terms of your creativity, your expression?
Without the intervention of modern medicines and machines, the chronically ill were the first to go. Epidemics and hunger cut down millions every day. Many people chose to take their lives rather than struggle to survive in a doomed world. Global temperatures all the while continued to rise, forcing more greenhouse gases and water vapor into the atmosphere in an accelerating, exponential feedback loop. Fires raged out of control in every city and every forest. Oceans too warm to absorb oxygen became lifeless except for vast mats of algae, which in turn died, emitting huge clouds of poisonous sulfur dioxide. Without proper maintenance, nuclear facilities across the planet began to melt down.
The artwork I do, the everyday artwork, is pretty much the same, the sketching, which keeps me in touch with how people look and feel. It's very important for me. The videos that I do that are my stories. Mazz Alone, which was about people learning to adjust to extinction. I think I've pretty much covered that one. It's like Extinction, you can't go any further than that. I should mention also that I've done a graphic novel that was published in France, translated, not here, so you can't get it here. But if you're in Paris, you can, or anywhere in France, you can order it. But that also deals with extinction.
Could you say what the name is of that? And because I'll have some people from Europe watching this, and I might be willing to do some looking around to see if I could dig up a copy of that as well.
I do have an English version. I have a few copies of that left, so I'll send you.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, very rare and quite a little bit different than the ending, but it does deal with right after I finished Bicyclopolis, that's the name of the book. Of course, I not only do I choose a difficult subject, I also choose a name that no one can pronounce. It's Bicyclopolis. I don't know how they pronounce it in French. Right after I finished that book is when I realized that the timetable for Extinction had been moved up quite a bit, largely because of the more recent understanding of the tipping points, that this is not going to be a linear progression, it's going to be abrupt jumps. I think in the beginning of the video, the first video I did about Extinction, which was Countdown to Extinction, I think that was the name, and Mazz Alone, the idea that it's if people are up on their physics, it has to do, and being a cartoonist, understanding physics is very difficult. But the idea that water does not do a gradual climb through its different phases, from ice to water to gas, because of the way atoms work in this particular atom. It jumps. It does. It's called phase jumps or something like that. So that the amount of energy that goes into melting the ice up there is really tremendous. And once that is done, as I understand it, the water gets heated up much quicker. So we are, for people who think that this is the way it's going to be for a while, just wait. It's going to be much more abrupt. Understanding that, right after I did Bicyclopolis, I realized I had to do something that addressed how abrupt the changes were going to be. Instead of being something that I thought, when I did Bicyclopolis, I told my translator that I imagined, I didn't say it in the book, but it's going to be about 70 years. That's what I previously thought. It really looks more like it's going to be somewhere in the realm of 10 or 15 years. Coming to terms with something that quick, it's kind of the difference between being told, I guess, I had a good friend who was told he had a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. And they told him he had a 90-something chance of dying within a year. How do you deal with that? How do you approach that? Mm-hmm. It's kind of a death sentence. We all have to kind of approach that in our own ways. I would like to think that he was a fighter, wonderful guy, and he chose to fight it. I'm not. I think I would have accepted it and tried to find some enjoyment in a few months of life.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much the predicament we're all in right now. And I think we all have to find our own. I'm hoping that Mazz Alone, because it's about a group of people, and they all go through different ways that they experience this denial is a big part. I'm not, that's another thing, is I'm not as judgmental of people who deny that global warming exists. I think that's, to some degree, that's part of the process. I have people who are environmentalists who think that they call people like me doomers. I think you had a video about something that, but it's a majority. It says that we've given up. In a way, some people equate denial with acceptance, and that's kind of an interesting thing that I still I have people who I know who are both who would judge me as harshly as someone who denied it, for saying that there really isn't anything. The difference is I do think that we have to kind of look, I think, is how can we be more compassionate going into this? Some people use the term hospice birth. And I think that's maybe a little bit less judgmental things going on, a lot less fighting, coming, maybe looking for all those spiritual and your videos go into that a bit. How can we accept this sentence that we have and be better towards others? And my art is kind of like that too. When I do a sketch of someone, and I learn something about them, and then I give them a sketch. It's my gift to them. It says, you kind of like a souvenir of this place, but a little bit more meaningful. You were here. You were doing this. You were enjoying yourself. I love particularly enjoying people who are having a good time. Didn't do that in the courtroom. Very few people have a good time. It's kind of funny story about that. If I can digress a bit, but
Sure.
I had to sketch at a trial. It's a sentencing, and it was a young man who had he had been caught trying to join one of those terrorist groups in the Middle East, and the FBI caught him, and he was very young, very foolish, very idealistic, I guess, and but he had a lot of support from his family, his community, and they were all there in the court. And he got off with some probation and a lot of advice from people, and particularly the judge, to get his life in order to stick to school and all that. So afterwards, I take my drawings out and I tape them on the wall outside the courtroom, because no cameras in the courtroom. And so while the television guy is filming the drawings taped to the wall, one of the family members comes up to me. He was the uncle of the young man. And he says, I'd like to buy that picture. And I said, no, you don't. I said, get the picture of him, graduating. I said, nobody in America, it was a recent immigrant, nobody in America hangs pictures of their relatives, their children, over the sofa in an orange jumpsuit. We don't do that here. But every time I sketch, whether that was, again, in a courtroom, you often see some very sad and horrible things. Where I sketch now is in places where people are having a good time, and I want to show them, and they generally are very happy about it. For a while there, Roberta and I were sketching. We had a gig doing exactly this. People we had a group that was paying us to sketch people, and they would get the sketches free and got paid. But it was right outside the city county building here in downtown Indianapolis. And very few people go into the city county building. with business that's happy. They're getting restraining orders. They're paying taxes. It's always some kind of interaction with the government. It's very different. Some people are getting out of jail, and they'd see the sign that said free sketches, and they'd sit down and I'd talk. I'd learn about their lives, very difficult lives. And I learned something about them. They learned something about me, and everyone was. I can't remember anybody who was unhappy with the sketch. It was such an important experience, very, very exhausting to a lot of these people, extremely difficult lives. And I would do things like, they'd say, please don't draw my missing tooth. I said, don't worry about that. I'll make you look like a movie star. And in the end, they would always, by the way, these are sketches, these are not caricatures. They're always happy because people have an image in their mind. Their perception is very different of themselves. And that's an important thing, by the way, if I could mention that also, is how we perceive things, and art is very important. And that's always something that I work with in as well, is that perception. Do we see the world around us clearly? It's a subjective thing, but it's something that if we share it, it becomes more that objective reality. It's one of the reasons why probably the biggest reason I don't have a car. My wife and I choose to be car free, and part of that is environmental. But the other main reason is that we experience the world better. It's not a canned experience. We're out there, we're rained on, the wind blows in our face, we get dirt in our eye. But we see things, we have time to stop and draw them, we have time to experience them. A lot of times it's not happy. Last year I was mugged and my pipe was stolen, but the police got that. But all of it is something that it informs me. It's part of the stories I tell. There are beautiful places to bike through, and people love to bike these beautiful places. And so do I. But I also bike the places that are pretty horrible because I want to experience them. And again, it informs the work I do. A lot of the dystopian images I have in my videos come from those bike trips through those really horrible places. I should add that one of the reasons we moved here to Indianapolis, it does have one of the best, probably the best bicycle and walking trails, urban trails in the country. It's called Cultural Trail, and it connects major places in downtown. Makes it so much easier for my wife and I to conduct our business, do our shopping, all those things. But it's also a place that we run into our neighbors and friends and strangers, and I've had so many interesting experiences, not necessarily all happy. And that's the important thing, is that technology, in our attempt to make ourselves more comfortable, more to distance ourselves from unpleasant experiences, whether it's with air conditioning in cars or our homes, which are just utterly, nature is beyond our experience for most people. And now with the technology of being able to experience everything on screens, we are really, that is significantly contributed, I think, to how people are spiritually and physically removed from nature. So that's the reason. If you see a great deal about bicycles in my book, that's part of it. And by the way, the title of the book was Bicyclopolis, And it was about a community that survives for two reasons. It has people who bike, um, and the other people are historical reenactors who have saved the experience of the skills of the pre-industrial era. And those two people, the mobility, people who have mobility that's not dependent on industrial production, and people who are able to do things that everyone was involved in farming, the crafts, and that sort of thing, pre-industrial skills. The combination of those two groups of people is the foundation of the city, Bicyclopolis, that survives well into the future after the industrial world has collapsed. And so that's the basis of that story.
Yeah.
It's
Interesting how much, as you're telling these stories, I'm noticing there's a lot of overlap with what ends up being the curriculum in some of the offerings that I put out in the website and so on, which are meant to be kind of the elevator pitch for my work is providing transformative support and resources to people bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And within that, there are these kind of threads that are very much like what you were just describing. Like, what are the resources, the external resources, and what are the internal resources that each of us bring? And we might bring it together if we're lucky enough to have sort of a neighborhood or a tribe or a family or some sort of grouping where we can share those inner and outer resources. Like, we've got bikes on the external, and we've got some of these skills that are not fossil fuel dependent. And some of the inner skills might be the ability to communicate in such a way that I have enough capacity in myself to be with somebody who's very different than myself, might have solidly different political views or views about the current issues about climate change or not, or blah, blah, blah. But there's a obvious skill set that could be called an inner resource that I can call on if I've expanded my capacity to be present with people with very different points of view and ways of being and so on, rather than kind of living the unexamined life of, I think, the average person, which is basically just being a kind of a duct taped together conglomeration of my opinions and my judgments and my triggers. And, that's not a real good formula for success of a small group that's trying to get together and make the best of challenging times. So I was just noticing that there were a number of features that you're talking about within your own stories and cartoons and expressions that seem to fit in the real-time coursework that is on offer in our world. In those little we call it Deep Academy is the name of the coursework offering and so on. So just noticing the overlap.
And I think it's important that you have the inner skills and the other skills, but that they really work together. Learn, for instance, gardening. Gardening is wonderful for the soul, organic. But yeah, working in the soil, working with plants, working with animals, that's all good to help this. And it's also important, I think, another thing is there's so many things to look for those historical times that were difficult and find out how those people adapted to those times, what mistakes many people made. Then, by the way, there's an absolutely wonderful book. One book I forgot to mention to you Just got it out of the library again. It's called The Unthinkable, by Amanda Ripley, and it's about largely about situational awareness, because we're going to be in a time of, when collapse happens, where conditions will change rapidly. And I think it's a good idea to, if you imagine yourself within those situations, if you compare them to situations that exist, basically be in the very place and time you're in, and be prepared for that to change. How will you adapt? What skills will you need? Being just aware will help you survive, but also, I think for a lot of people, they think, well, I just don't want to survive. I don't want to, they have, but you're very likely going to be surviving. I personally, and I don't want to give advice to people, but I personally, I'm curious what it's going to be. Is it going to be like no drugs? Is it going to, how are people going to adapt? Is it going to be chaotic? Or will it find its way like water does? It finds a path. I recently watched a video on YouTube about how the natural world, the natural animals and plants adapted to the restricted zone around Chernobyl. That many scientists thought that it would become a desert, a wasteland, and the opposite has happened. It has become a sanctuary. Even animals and plants that were endangered in the rest of Europe have thrived in the radioactive conditions of Chernobyl, and it's got a lot of them scratching their heads. We cannot predict what's going to happen in the future. One thing I can predict is that the Earth will survive, and life will likely survive in one form or another. We've had several periods of extinction, some really nasty ones, like the Permian extinction. And we can certainly learn from that one. But the Earth goes on, and the Earth will go on without us, without humans. Humans have done some very wonderful things and some very terrible things, but it's been quite a ride. And I'm hoping to experience the rest of it and document it as it goes along in my journals and my videos. That's what keeps me going. Is living in this moment, documenting it. Very few people, by the way, very few people keep journals, and historians love journals. Of course, I don't know who's going to read them after we go extinct. But there's something to be said about documenting in order to live in that moment, so that you understand. If you put something on paper, if you write it, if you describe it, if you write poetry about it, paint it, in whatever form that creative, that will help you be grounded in the here and now, in your observation. So you're not just reacting in a frightened.
Yeah. I'm wondering if what you're talking about, it seems very similar to a part of the practices. The punchline for my body of work is that what it comes down to is what got us into this predicament is that we've disconnected from all the primary sources of meaning and relationship in human life. And all I could figure to do once I came up with that realization and wrote my book about it and all that was to see what could I and others get out of bed and have some way of expressing in a good way into this world. I just want to make the world a little bit better. I'm clear. I'm not going to save anything. I'm not going to fix anything at scale. It's just not going to happen. So what can I do? And what I was hearing you just point to is having a series of practices about reconnecting in each of the areas, like deeper self, my ability to relate with others, my connection with the earth, and with even soul, the dimension of soul. And it seems like, once again, there's you have a different set of words about it, but it seems like there's tremendous overlap in what it seems to be you're indirectly telling us about the inner resources that you carry, that you pull out when you need to um, kind of stabilize in the face of this incredibly disruptive world. So that's what I was hearing. I don't know if that rings a bell for you.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's, I used to feel that there were other things, that we could fix problems. And it's not, it's not a wrong thing. It's just that at this time, there's so much carbon in the atmosphere, the oceans, there's so much change. And then there's plenty of other things involved.
Yeah.
They're all in my video, but we have so many problems that they're really insurmountable. But does that mean that that we should be like perpetually angry or depressed? We can find within ourselves the way we relate to it, and that really involves first yourself and then the people around you. Do the best you can in that circumstance. Everyone can do it differently, and I watch your videos and you talk about it. I have I suppose a slightly different. I'm happiness is that skills. If you have skills that can, and I don't mean necessarily artistic skills that can make that don't harm anybody, and that maybe help people in some ways. That's probably the best thing to do right now. It's the actual physical doing of things. There's a connection between the mind and the soul and the hands. I think we've lost that too. And I love it when and by the way, I do use computers. I'm kind of a Luddite deal. But every Luddite I know knows everything about computers. Incredible geeks. But it's interesting when you do Photoshop. It has a picture of scissors. I think all these things that people are going to eventually cut and paste. We still use those old phrases. We put the cart before the horse. We use phrases that nobody remembers, but they actually relate to real work. People have names that relate to the work that they used to do. People have a name like Cooper or Wainwright.
Or use an expression like rule of thumb.
Absolutely, these are, and it's always fun. And by the way, that's internet's great. Look up those things. They're interesting to find out. Wonderful book, by the way. I mean, series of books. Author Eric Sloan was a major influence on me artistically, but also and he more famous is, by the way, he was the first TV weatherman. But he did a lot of wonderful things. But one of the most wonderful things he's most known for, he painted barns in New England. He's known for that. But he's also known for a series of books about the lost way of the pre-industrial way of life. And he did a whole book on tools. People used to, of course, before the industrial age, when everything came from the factory, people used to make their own tools. They built their own homes. They did everything. Learning about how that was done and really how important it was. And also, we must never romanticize that way of life. In those times, people were very wasteful. They had, at that time, when Europeans came to America, there was a whole continent of old trees. A lot of those were wasted, cut down, and turned into wood ash, which was used to make potash. This is a thought. We used to pave streets with trees and things like that. So it was not all, I'm not saying it was all good, but there were things back then, and he's very honest about it. There are things that people did back then that skills that were good at working with wood or working um, with, and people who work, people who reenact those things, um, they get something out of it. They learn that there wasn't always a time when you could have an app that did something for you. You actually had to go out and get the materials and do it yourself. And how just knowing that and going through that process, I think it's been very beneficial to me. It's gardening, it's cooking, with making things from scratch, even when I don't have to. Walking and bicycling, and I can take something, do something faster. Drawing instead of taking a photograph. Although I do all those modern things, I choose to do those at times. I force myself because it connects me more with the world, with other people, and then it also does something for my soul.
Yeah. Well, Ken, it's just been a delight to find out a bit more about how you see your world, how you move about in your world, how you hold it, um, in addition to what's the obvious, what we can see in your films or your cartoons or, these other expressions. It's again, just remarkable to me how much overlap there is in two very different media. I couldn't sketch myself out of a paper bag, and where I go is into more video or writing poetry and so on. But there's so much overlap in terms of particularly the resourcing, the work that I do in resourcing people, in offering them a safe environment in which they can explore these tough topics and also build their skills, expand themselves for that. And I hear you doing the same thing, just in an entirely different way. So it's fascinating.
I just want to add that if anyone wants to use any of my images, which they find on the internet, they're more than welcome. They don't have to even pay me or any of that stuff. Because I honestly don't believe in copyright. I don't think it helps creativity. So you're welcome to use it, and you're welcome to share my videos. If people think that it might be useful to show in a group, then I highly recommend that, because you really should talk to someone after you've seen particularly Mazz Alone. And it's there to provoke a discussion. So,
Right. Well, thank you. You just answered one of my, yeah.
I say people are welcome and free to use anything that I create in any way they want.
Thank you. You just answered one of my questions, which is I would love to feather in during this, in post-production on this video, on this interview. I was hoping that it would be all right for me to feather in your images, moments from your videos and so on. So it sounds like that's okay to do.
Oh, absolutely. And if people want a high resolution JPEG or a file, they can certainly contact me, and you're welcome to have it totally free.
Right.
There's no monetary thing. I just want to be sincere.
And Avidor, it's really just been a pleasure. I so thank you for bringing your unique perspective on this world, and there's just a richness and a heartfulness and a delightfully slowed down pace talking with you, and I really feel fed by that, feel nourished by this conversation. So if you wouldn't mind hanging on for just a moment, I'm going to turn off the recording and get us off the air, and I could get a little bit more of the information about how people can contact you and so on, and I'll put that in the show notes. Was there anything else you'd like to just finish up with? Final message for the folks?
Well, just thank you for having them. It's been wonderful talking to you.
All right.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.